Hi everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I'm sharing with you some of my favorite writing podcasts, or podcasts that are great for writers. These are all in my auto listen category, and it's a mix of kind of podcasts that interview authors and talk to them about craft, and podcasts by industry professionals that give you really excellent insights into the business and how it works on all sides. Like, these are the professional podcasts I listen to where I get a lot of my own insights. And then as a bonus, I am going to rec one podcast about books because it is my favorite podcast and I rec it to everyone I know. If you're bookish, you have to listen to this one. I'm going to start with First Draft Podcast by Sarah Enni. This is a fantastic podcast if you want to hear more from some of your favorite authors, also authors you might not have heard from, lots of new and emerging authors, and it's just all about kind of their journey to writing and kind of how their life has informed their writing and really great questions about craft. The podcast is hosted by Sarah Enni, who is a journalist by trade, and you can tell. What I love about First Draft is her questions are just so on the mark. First of all, you can tell she does her research. She reads the books of the people that she talks to. She has very thoughtful and, kind of layered, detailed questions, and she has a way of getting just really good stories and answers out of the authors. So I highly recommend it. I've learned a lot about some of my favorite authors. I've learned a lot about authors I wasn't as familiar with. Really recommend First Draft Podcast. The next podcast is a longtime fave that has recently made a return to glory, and that is the Shipping and Handling Podcast by Jennifer Udden and Bridget Smith. So Jennifer Udden and Bridget Smith are both literary agents who specialize in YA and middle grade and a couple other genres, and they are really good friends that live in New York, and they're both Fanish, so they both come from fandoms, which is where the title of the podcast comes from, Shipping and Handling, like shipping things. I don't know about the handling. So they talk about a combination of kind of industry stuff, but it's always informed by the fact that they're both Fanish women, so they have basically really similar tastes to me. They talk about the kind of books they like to read, they talk about the kind of movies and whatnot that I really like, but they always come with like very funny, insightful, real talk about what the industry looks like from an agent's perspective. They used to post more infrequently, but thankfully recently they've had a return to form and they now do episodes every other week like clockwork. To give you an idea, the most recent episode was all about contracts, where they demystified all of these different contract things. They've done episodes that are like a typical day in the life of an agent. They've done episodes about querying, just a really great look behind the curtain of what the industry looks like from the perspective of agents. Bridget and Jen are also really great at answering questions. You can tweet them, ask them questions on Tumblr anonymously as well, or email them and they answer questions on air. The Q&A portion is one of my favorite parts of the podcast. The next podcast I recommend is newer, but really chock full of information, and it's Literati Cast. It's again by another literary agent, Jennifer Laughran. The style of her show is that she interviews a different industry professional, someone that she knows in the biz, who covers a different aspect of the business than she can each week. So to give you an idea, recently she talked to the kid lit book buyer from an independent bookstore. She's talked to picture book authors and illustrators. She's talked to editors. So she offers a really nice snapshot of different parts of the industry while of course offering an agent's perspective on every topic. So especially if you are a writer who's interested in the younger aspects of kidlit, so middle grade and picture books, Jennifer does a lot of middle grade and picture book stuff, and so there's a lot of that content on the podcast. Next is the Pub Crawl Podcast. So this is the podcast for the Publishing Crawl blog. I also recommend the blog as a resource. And the podcast is hosted by S.J. Jones, the author who was previously an editor at a Big Five publisher, and Kelly Van Sant, who is a literary agent. The Pub Crawl Podcast has a robust archive. They either cover industry topics or craft topics. So they have different episodes that cover different things, and Kelly and JJ talk in depth about the various topics. I especially love the episodes where they go into things like money, how it works on the editor side, because JJ was an editor, and also kind of covering the transition because JJ is now a very successful YA author, and kind of both sides of that. And then of course Kelly is able to offer perspective as an agent. The Pub Crawl podcast does post a bit less frequently just because both Kelly and JJ have very busy schedules, but I highly recommend dipping into their archive. You can of course get it on iTunes, but they also have their archive on SoundCloud. The next podcast is one of my all-time favorites. It's newer. It only has 9 episodes so far, but every single one of them is gold. If you want to know where I go to get kind of the sage advice I need to survive this business, it's this podcast, and it is the Get to Work Hurley podcast. It is by Kameron Hurley, who is an adult science fiction writer. And so even though she comes from a different genre background, I find her real talk is just so refreshing, and there's plenty of things that she encounters in the adult science fiction world that are still very relevant to publishing as a whole and to YA. But I just love Kameron's, well, I love her sense of humor. She's very dry, she's very blunt, she's very frank, which is totally my kind of deal, if you couldn't tell, if you couldn't guess. And I like the way that she tackles topics. Kameron talks a lot about kind of mental health and writing, stress and writing, money. She talks very frankly about money and the juggle that you have to do to kind of make a career work. She talks very honestly about things like jealousy and disappointments, and I just really adore this podcast. I can't tell you how many times one of her podcasts has just been so well timed to what has been going on in my publishing life. You know, there have been times I haven't even known that I was having a bad week, and I've listened to her podcast and the topic has just like hit me right in the heart and really made a difference in kind of how I approach things and tackled the rest of the week. So I really love this podcast. It gets way less love than it deserves. I find a lot of people don't know about it because it is only on episode 9. It is newer. So the Get to Work Hurley podcast publishes approximately once a month. So it's a once monthly podcast. Totally worth the wait though. I really, really love it. And last but certainly not least is the favorite podcast of mine that is all about books. This isn't specifically helpful to like industry or craft, although it does kind of show you perhaps what not to do. And it is the Worst Bestsellers podcast. This is literally a podcast where they read best-selling books that are terrible and they talk about them, they snark about them. But don't worry, it's not too mean. It's honestly really fun, and especially in the way episodes I find they actually really strike a balance. They don't shit on YA, because like us, they genuinely love young adult fiction. So the Worst Bestsellers podcast is hosted by Kate and Renata. They're both Fanish. Do you see a trend in the kind of podcasts I like to listen to? They're both Spanish women who love books. One of them is a librarian, one of them used to work in a bookstore, and they're just wonderful and salty about all of the right things. So as I mentioned, the concept, the conceit of the podcast is that they read books that are bestsellers that are either obviously terrible, might be terrible, or occasionally surprise them and turn out to be actually good books. I've actually really appreciated the episodes. Like, they did one on Nora Roberts. They read a Nora Roberts book, and the episode was so refreshing because they were like, this book was amazing. We love Nora Roberts. She deserves all the things. So it's kind of nice. And also, while they have done all of the Twilight books, they do not shit on Twilight as a rule. Same thing with 50 Shades. They're very respectful of the audiences that like these kinds of books. But that said, do they go full salt on things like Dianetics and Bill O'Reilly books and whatnot? Yes, they do. There's some great salt and some fantastic episodes of this podcast. It posts every other week on Mondays. They are wonderfully consistent like clockwork. I highly recommend dipping into their archives. When I first started listening, I skipped around. I started with the YA episodes, so there's one for The Selection and for Red Queen and for Forest of Hands and Teeth and Twilight, as I mentioned. But then I loved them so much that I started just kind of listening to every single episode, regardless of what the book is and whether I know it or I've read it or it falls into a genre that I like. I find every single episode delightful. And it is worth mentioning one of my favorite things about this podcast, because if you're not sold yet, I hope you will be now. Every episode they do something called the Rock, Paper, Snikt. Kate says who Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson would be if he were in the book. Renata says who Wolverine would be if he was in the book. And then the special guest, there's always a guest who reads the book with them and is on the episode, has to choose between rock, snikt, or paper, which is to leave the book as is. And I just find it so hilarious, the different ways that Kate and Renata find to work Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and Wolverine into these different books. And it's always like is someone finally gonna choose paper and leave the terrible book the way that it is? Or maybe the book isn't so terrible. I just adore the worst bestsellers, so it gets my wholehearted recommendation, as do all of these podcasts. I'm subscribed to every single one of these, and as soon as a new episode pops up in my podcast app, I listen to it immediately. I hope this was helpful and gives you some new things to listen to. Let me know down below in the comments, what are some of your favorite writing podcasts, the auto listens for you? Do you like listening to podcasts for writing? Let me know down below. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, I post you videos 2 to 3 times a week all about YA and writing and the industry, craft, books, and so on. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.